Everybody, it's Yellow Matt, and today we're talking about the PS Vita. You probably already know this, but for the uninformed, the PS Vita was Sony's second venture into the handheld market. It was the PSP's successor and, essentially, was trying to do what the Switch did but 5 years earlier, which was to bring console gaming experiences on the go. Similarly to the PSP competing with the DS, the Vita was competing with the 3DS. But the latter outsold the Vita massively, about 5 times more in fact. We don't have exact figures on Vita sales, but it probably sold around 16 million systems, give or take. But why wasn't the Vita successful? Why did it make Sony not want to give it a successor? Let's take a look back as I talk about my favorite console of all time. So, our story starts at E3 2011, when Sony first announced their next handheld device, the NGP, was actually named the PS Vita. With a rear touchpad, an OLED touchscreen and 2 analog sticks, and with power to display graphics similar to the PS3, the Vita was an amazing little device. The system launched at $249 for the Wi-Fi variant and at $299 for the 3G variant, which was a lot at the time. Even though the 3DS launched at the same price, Nintendo quickly dropped the price to $169 because, unlike Sony, they were aware that people didn't want to pay $300 for an handheld device. The price is one of the factors of why the Vita failed, but we'll get into that later on in the video. The Vita's launch was relatively good, with big PlayStation exclusives like Uncharted and Wipeout at launch, and with other games promised and some not delivered, like add to that PSP and PS1 backwards compatibility, and buyers had a lot of games to play at launch. Moving on, the Vita launched as expected but greatly underperformed later, but Sony still had big exclusives coming out, like Gravity Rush and Call of Duty. That hasn't aged well. That game was, it was a bit bad. But as 2012 dragged on, big third parties wound up abandoning the Vita as the games and the system itself just weren't selling well. And one thing that worsened the condition even further was Capcom's decision to put Monster Hunter, a huge system seller for the PSP, at least in Japan, on the Vita's competitor, the 3DS. So, from then on, Sony decided to adopt two different strategies for the Vita, one for the Western market and one for the Asian market. For the Western market, Sony would try to push indies, such as Hotline Miami, and that strategy worked as the Vita amassed a reputation as an indie machine, with great games like Stardew Valley and Crypto the Necrodancer being eventually released for it. But in Japan, Sony didn't have to do much, as handheld gaming was way more popular there, so the Vita got a reputation as a JRPG machine, with great games like Persona 4 Golden, Odin Sphere Leftrasir, the Danganronpa games, and Final Fantasy X. With great games like this, Japan's support also helped the Vita sell well in the West, with a game like Persona 4 Golden selling massively. Now, in 2013, Sony launched the PS4, their newest home console, and since the Vita wasn't doing that well, they decided to focus all of their software development efforts on the PS4. So, what was Sony going to do with the Vita? Continue to make games for it? No, they instead made it a companion device for the PS4. I guess they thought the Wii U would do well and decided to copy it. Whatever the case, almost all of Sony's marketing for the Vita after that was marketing as a $200, yeah, it finally got a price drop, companion device for the PS4. But in 2013, due to Sony giving up the device almost completely, the Vita saw no AAA or even AA games, with the biggest release possibly being Dragon's Crown. But 2014 was a big year for the system, with two new versions of it coming out. The Vita got a new version, a slim model, which was 20% thinner and 15% lighter, that replaced the OLED screen with an LCD panel, increased the battery life, and added 1 GB of internal memory. The opinion of the VITA community is that the original model is better just due to the OLED screen, but to be honest, you can't go wrong with either model if you can find them for cheap. The VITA, like I mentioned before, was trying to bring console gaming experiences with you on the go. And to bring that to life, Sony decided to make a VITA console that could output only to the television, the PS TV. The PlayStation TV is a pretty nifty machine. It's basically a VITA, so it can play VITA, PSP and PS1 games. At the time, it didn't sell very well, mostly because Sony was marketing as a companion device to the PS4, and people had no idea it could actually play video games without a PS4. For example, I wanted to get one when it first came out, and the store clerk just told me that, yeah, it can't play Vita games, why do you want this system for? Well, I ended up buying it anyways, because I knew what it could do, but that just goes to show that Sony's marketing didn't really help the system. It was also stumped by some of the Vita's other fails, like expensive memory cards, which by this point Sony still hadn't realized was a terrible idea, and so the device was eventually discontinued in 2015. From 2014 onward, the Vita didn't have much going on. There were still releases, with some games like Minecraft selling pretty well in the system, and the Trails of Cold Steel series, along with many other JRPGs, were still being released for it. But it was finally over on March 31st, when Sony discontinued the production of physical cartridges for the system, having discontinued the Vita itself in the beginning of the same month. Some companies still keep releasing physical games for the system, like limited run games, but now the Vita's flame has finally been put out. Now that we finally got the story of the system out of the way, it's time to talk about the games. The Vita had a pretty good library of its own if you like JRPGs, like I do, or indie games. It was also an amazing machine for PS2 ports with games like Sly Cooper, Ratchet & Clank, Final Fantasy X, and it could also play all PS1 and PSP games, so you were pretty well served. The Vita also has a lot of great games in other genres, to name some like Tearaway, Killzone Mercenary, Little Big Planet, etc. But now I want to take a quick look at what I think are the two best games in the system. Probably the best open world game for the Vita, also the only good one excluding the PSP GTAs. Gravity Rush is an amazing experience, a game that spawned the franchise, and it got remastered for the PS4, so there's no reason to buy a Vita to get it, but it's an amazing experience. I regret playing this game when I was 11 years old because I wish I remembered the story better, but one thing this game has is an amazing atmosphere. Jesus Christ, when I was a kid, I wasted so much time just navigating the streets of the game, and the comic book style and soundtrack are just so amazing and the world is just so cool to explore. Not to spoil anything, but in my opinion, the best part is when you go to the bottom of the world. That part has just so much atmosphere, I love it. Even though the game loses some charm because its combat really isn't that good, basically press square to do a gravity kick, the feel of the game is so amazing that I have to recommend it. Whew, boy, isn't this game amazing? It's like one hell of a game. It has everything I think you could ever ask for if you like RPGs. It has some of the best combat, only surpassed by its successor. It has the best cast of characters I have ever seen in a video game. It has an amazing story to boot. The music is amazing. The game is really beautiful too. Like, Inaba really feels like your home. It feels like a city you'd want to live in. And everything is just so fleshed out. And this is the best version of the PS2 RPG. So if you have a Vita, or even if you don't, you need to get this game. It's good enough that I'd say you should buy a Vita to get it. So it's really good, trust me. Just play it already. So, why did the Vita end up failing? As we saw, it had everything to be successful, but Sony's greed ended up biting them in the ass. The number one reason that the Vita failed was memory cards and a high price. Think about it. The cheaper version of the system launched for $250, and the price of an 8GB memory card. In my opinion, the bare minimum that you need if you want some digital games is $30. Couple that with a game to play and you're at $320. With that amount of money, you could get a 250GB PS3, $260, and that already came with the game, so you still had $60 left, which you could buy a game with. Couple that with Sony's stubbornness to lower the price, making it a system with a comparatively huge barrier of entry when its competitor was selling for around $200, was a big reason the Vita failed. The other big reason was that, due to more powerful handheld hardware, games were becoming more expensive to develop, like the Vita was about console gaming on the go, so most developers didn't have the money to develop for a console like that when they could develop for the PS3, and games that could work on less powerful devices were often made for the 3DS. So all of this led to a lack of video games on the system, as the lack of users made it so that nobody wanted to develop games for it. And the lack of games made it that nobody wanted to buy a Vita, in sort of a nasty feedback loop that trapped the Vita in a cycle of poor sales. Sony could still have saved it though. Imagine the Vita with an exclusive God of War game, or imagine a world where Sony dropped the price of the memory cards and the Vita itself. Well, that's a reality we are never going to get, unfortunately. But to not end this video on a bad note, let's take a look at the current status of the Vita in 2019. Well, is the Vita still alive in 2019? Well, kind of. It's being kept alive by its loyal fans, like me, who still prefer to game on the platform. Maybe we have some sort of mentality of support for the underdog? Whatever the case, the Vita in 2019 is still a good purchase if you like JRPGs, but if you do, you probably already have one. It's also a great emulation machine with perfect emulation for the PSP and PS1, and with Homebrew you can get every system up to the Nintendo 64. It doesn't work super well, but you know, Mario 64 is playable, so that's pretty good. So would I recommend you buy it? Well, even though I love it, I have to say, not really, unless you really like handheld gaming. A lot of the things that the Vita can do can be done better with other systems, and even though Persona 4 Golden is an amazing game, I can't fathom recommending a system only for one game. But if you want to know more about if the system is worth it in 2019, Mystic has a video about it that I will link in the description. So, through all of this, we have finally reached the end. The Vita is an amazing console and has provided me with some of the best gaming experience that I have ever had. It's a shame it did so poorly when the homebrew community and its hardcore fans proved that the device has a lot of potential. Also a shame that due to it, we won't have a successor to the Vita, as Sony's replacement for it is remote play on phones. But if we think of the Vita as an inspiration for the Switch, a system that I and many others love, it's got an important place on the video game and the console industry. Hey everybody, if you like this video about the Vita, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel, it really helps. Also, let me know down in the comments below how you felt about it and if there's any topic that you'd want me to do or any video game that you'd like me to cover. From today on, I'll try to have an upload ready every 2 weeks so you can look forward to my videos. Well, for now, goodbye and see you next time.